Fantastic. Well, here we are. This is the ninth sign this evening. We are talking about Sagittarius. Sagittarius is a fire element sign and a mutable modality sign, and is of the positive or yang expression. Sagittarius is, I think, a good key phrase for Sagittarius is when I think, I must speak. Sagittarius is very much about communication, but communication with loads and tons of spirit behind it, tons of energy. And because they have an extraordinary power of mental activity. So they tend to want to bring reason to bear, as it were. So that is to say, every time they see something happening, like a phenomenon or anything that would happen in the world in their observation, they would want to get to the bottom of it. They want to understand it. They want to have it teach them something. And in a way, at the same time, they also want to teach others. They want to see it as by example, for example. So they are very good at facing life in a very kind of fair way. They look at it and they then reduce it. Any problems in life, they reduce them down to the simplest of terms. So with Sagittarius, they're good to try and solve problems. They're quite good problem solvers. They have an insatiable curiosity. They have a mental energy that never flags. They keep on keeping on. And when they get an interest, they really get into it. And they're very good at getting, when they're interested in something, they're very good at getting others to be interested in it as well. So it's almost like, you know, they make quite a lot of rapid progress in things as well. They move quite quickly towards finding answers. They like to be like a center of helpfulness or of illumination for others. They like to take interest in the welfare of others. How are you doing? How's it all going? They're quite like, they like that. And therefore also in the education of others. Did you understand the way things I do? And stuff like that is very Sagittarian. So they are very much teachers because their ruling planet is Jupiter. And Jupiter, as we have already looked at, is the planet of wisdom and the planet of higher learning and education and understanding and philosophy. So Sagittarians tend to have all those attributes as well. So a good Sagittarius would be about awakening, wanting to awaken the mind of those it is teaching to or professing to or talking to, and teaching them to observe and to reason and think for themselves as well. So a Sagittarius has a very great skill in dialectic. They love a good conversation. They love a topic. They love to get into it and they love to talk to others about it. Sometimes they'll want to take the high road and they'll just be like, they'll have all the answers. And they won't have time to listen to anybody else because they think they found the truth. But other times they want to discuss a topic and really get into it and really discover it and really understand it. So they are quite the antagonist. They can push people, and they don't like foolish types. They don't have much time and they don't have much mercy for them either. So Sagittarius, if they do spot someone who they don't think is up to their mark or their standard, they'll be as tell them as much. So they do take the moral. They're very moralistic. Okay, and that can sometimes be quite difficult, actually, for Sagittarius, because some people they can estrange themselves from people by their high standards of how the world should be or humanity should be. So the symbol for Sagittarius is the archer. It is the centaur. And like an archer, they draw their bow and arrow and they have their target, and they'll find the chink in the armor. You know, they're very accurate. So when they, you know, it's like having the thunderbolts of Jupiter, if you like, as well, because Jupiter is Zeus as well. So it's like the thunderbolts of the gods, if you like. The truth, the directness, the frankness, the honesty is all very Sagittarius. So, you know, they have an intuitive knowledge of insight into others. So if they do have an adversary, they know where the chinks in the armor are, and they'll penetrate those very quickly with their arrows, symbolically speaking. So they don't really miss their mark. And in a way, this makes them very good at the legal profession. So you'll find a lot of Sagittarius called to the bar and being excellent in court, because Jupiter is very linked to justice as well, as is Saturn, which we'll be looking at later on. But there's a sense of finding the truth as well, makes them good research journalists, good writers. They are the sort of people who also, you know, because they like to see others devoted as they are. So they're into the idea of devotees. So you can get Sagittarius being very philosophical and very religious and very faith-oriented. They find that thing that gives them their truth, and then they'll be sure to show everybody else that as well. And often by practical discourse, they'll talk about it, because that's one of their strengths, is the idea of communication. So they make very good sports people. They're quite good at sports. They love the big outdoors, the great outdoors. They love a nice big view, an overlook, an outsea, a larger space. They like to roam around. Sagittarius is naturally linked to horses, but also they're good with their dogs. So they like to have pets. They like to go long walks. They like that space. They revel in the open air. And they don't really like stuffy rooms. They like that space, and they need to get out and about. So the breezy uplands and the peaks, and they have a lot of sympathy for those who don't find that life. So you might often say a Sagittarius is saying, "Oh, you know, you should get out more," kind of thing would be quite a Sagittarius sort of statement. So the Sagittarian is, you know, they collect information, you know, and that adds to their knowledge. As in, that means that they can then show their common sense. They can always have a remedy for something. They have theories for things. They have, you know, but they like to interact with humanity. You know, they'll see the world and they want to get involved. And they like to fraternize with all sorts of people. So you don't get Sagittarius as being people who would stand back from anything, really. They like to get involved. So they're quite classless. They tend to be like, right, I'll just get on because I'm going to learn about this, or I feel for these sort of people, so I'm going to get involved with them. And so that's the sort of Sagittarius thing. They don't tend to be, they're not like snobs or they don't look down on others, put it that way. They get very involved, and with whatever situation they're in. And so in a way, and that's all adding to their idea of what they're here to teach about, what they're here to learn, to then preach. Sagittarius are preachers as well. So in a way, there's a sense of being like seeing the world as one big family. They would be trying to let everybody understand what they believe in. But they look with friendly eyes on the world. So they have that sense of being very outgoing, you know, as in They like to stay in touch with with everything if they can, and they can't often be tied down very specifically to family life. They're very outgoing. They're very out there, very large, sort of optimistic, enthusiastic characters, and you can't really get them into the idea of the home. But they do it, of course they do, you know. But there's a sense also of something bigger and greater and more expansive within that field, as it were. So there's a sense of keeping their mind and their beliefs very nourished, and so there's a sense of, you know, trying to keep them as the people who are seeking out something to believe in, something to proclaim, as a Sagittarius. So they would be like, you know, I found this and I think it's like that, and they're like that. They like that kind of thing. So they can be quite, in a way, they actually can be quite dominant in that sort of way, because they're searching for meaning, and they have a lot of frankness and outspoken sincerity. A Sagittarian could often be the sort of person who has a lot of like honest admissions, and their honesty can sometimes get them into trouble, you know. In fact, they can often be very tactless with how they speak. So they can, you know, like what's it called? Like the idea of foot in mouth, you know, it's quite, or hoof in mouth with Sagittarius. They can kind of like say things and then they'll move on to the next thing. But someone can be going, whoa, they really said it then, didn't they? You know, and you know, Sagittarius can be like that, you know. Quite naturally, they're very wide awake. You know, they're very kind of like, wow, here we are, and so they're kind of like, they have a lot of energy that can be dominate and be quite direct. You know, so therefore they get on very well with Aries and Leo, the other fire signs, and air signs understand them. So Gemini and Libra and Aquarius, of course, understand Sagittarius. They get that. They get, you know, they get an affinity with them. They sort of get to sort of see, make good friends and good relationships. Air and other fire signs. So they demand freedom of choice. Essentially, Sagittarius. They don't like to be dictated to by others. They like to do the dictating, actually, and they tend to be the sort of people who have a lot of very bright ways, you know, and you know, friendship can be mistaken for love. Love can be mistaken for friendship. That's often the case with Sagittarius. And so when it comes to, you know, it's the truth of the relationship as well. So that's the tactlessness of the potential of the tactlessness as well, because they can speak things and then someone's like, well, you know, sometimes you get the truth out of them and it's like, wow. So, you know, but that's, in a way, they can be very inspirational, you know, but also there can be this great issue where they'll say things that they maybe shouldn't have said. So with Sagittarius, they tend to be, they can be a little skeptic because they examine things very carefully. So when it comes to things like faith or belief or religion, they'll go like, right, okay, then. So what is it about this? And so their mind compels them to examine and reason things out. And then they will have a sense of, you know, they need to find a satisfactory thing behind it, as it were. And that gives them the fuel to carry on. Then when they align to that, then they really take off with it. You know, they'll explore it, because Sagittarius is the great explorer. So, you know, they are also the sort of people who do, you know, like the marathon type things, or the climb the mountain, cross the desert, sail the ocean. All these things are very Sagittarius, and you're likely to find someone with planets in Sagittarius who does that sort of stuff. So, and in a way, if they see shortcomings in something, they will point it out, because it's about showing people, about being, again, it's inspirational. They have to say, well, I think this or that about something. They're very breezy, they're very unconventional, they're very energetic. That's all Sagittarius. And they can be, it's almost a sense of, they're very good with their sense of having an unceasing or varying creative thought form. That their mental space is very expansive. So they have, what we call mind stuff. It's like having a sculptor, shaping something. They would want to see that manifest as their belief or their truth. And they love their freedom to things. So they have a lot of ideals and dreams. And it's the freedom of the mind, the freedom to roam or expand or travel. And this is Sagittarius, very much so. They're travelers. They are great students, but you find them at higher levels of learning. Is the higher up you go with university and things like that, the more Sagittarius you'll find. And so they they tend to be the sort of people who love a good argument. They really enjoy a sense of active encounters that where they can discuss or debate things. The idea of dialectic again, the idea of let's get into this and really sort this one out, But they tend to also they're great comedians because they love to find the fun in something. So they crack jokes constantly, and that's part of their finding the shortcomings in things. Is they will have a great hilarity at all sorts of stuff, and in a way it's quite fun to see. Although also it can be with Sagittarius if it is because it gets it's a constant thing sometimes with them. So it can be quite tiring. That's why they go to find their big space, because they know in a way that they need to create the space around them, because they have that expansive outlook that never limits. So so they can get quite into extraneous matter. They can go too far on a subject, and that can be quite entertaining. But it can be unexpected, as well. Like it's taking something a bit too far. So they're very good at that. It's like a sort of misguided enthusiasm, and so this is all part of the Sagittarius. They make great poets. They make great authors. You'll find them teaching and. And generally speaking, they are trying to get higher awareness out of worldly experience. That's a good phrase for a Sagittarius. As a sign, it seeks higher awareness out of worldly experience. And it is also expanding cultural boundaries in the quest for the truth. So Sagittarius will be like, how far can it go with that? Because it will uncover what is the truth behind it. So they can be quite blunt in that way. So now I'm going to present you some positives and negatives attributes of Sagittarius. So like what we could call the evolved type and the unevolved type of the sign. This is people with planets in those signs, okay? So it can be the sun in Sagittarius, but it could be any planet in Sagittarius, particularly the seven, as in, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. These are the conscious planets. When you have someone with these planets any of those planets in those Sagittarius, they can have positive and negative attributes. And as you will discover in charts, if you have difficult aspects branching off from planets in a sign, to another sign, then you're likely to have more challenges in expressing those, and more easygoing aspects can be more positive. But we'll talk about this another time as well. But mainly, so I like to think of Sagittarius as a positive expression. They are purposeful, single-minded, goal-directed, and aspiring. But on the flip side of that, they can be impractical, they can be unrealistic, they can be very impatient, and they can have their head in the clouds. A classic Sagittarius, a young Sagittarius is, are we nearly there yet? You'll hear it in the back of the car. Are we nearly there yet? That's quite Sag, or at least Jupiter. So, a positive Sagittarius expression would be prophetic, far-sighted, future-oriented, planning. A good Sagittarius can plan, right? But some of them are unable to see the immediate realities, and they don't plan. They just go for whatever's in the moment. And so some positive side of Sagittarius would be like saying they search, they seek the truth, they're philosophical, they're idealistic, they're open-minded, they're self-improving. Whereas a flip side, Sagittarius would be ceaselessly speculating on something. I think that's going to happen. I think, like gamblers maybe, right? Quite Sagittarius to be a gambler. And or overly abstract, or obtruse, or self-deluding. However, well-evolved Sagittarius is a very wise, and in fact, wisdom is one of their key words. I mean, the wise Sagittarius is, they're excellent to talk to when you find a good one. And they're profound, and they're quite discerning, and they're enlightened, and they're very well read, and they're very inspiring. However, the unevolved Sagittarius is very opinionated, or quite bookish, or obscure, or pretentious. An evolved Sagittarius would be inspirational, guiding, and teaching. The unevolved would be long-winded, or imposing their truth upon others when it wouldn't be welcome or needed. So they are ethical, they're very principled. However, they can be too moralistic, and they can be quite dogmatic, and they can be preachy, and they can be intolerant, and they can be hypercritical. A more evolved Sagittarius might be someone who is very direct, frank, and truthful. An unevolved Sagittarius, or a difficultly placed, can be blunt, tactless, or outspoken. So, in fact, I think maybe saying unevolved is not quite the right way of describing it there. I think, these are characteristics or parts of the personality or tendencies in personality that can be seen in most Sagittariuses, to be honest. And with all the signs, we've all got our good and bad points. So, or challenges and difficulties, or high good points and not so good points. But these are how it's finding those and working those out really. So a good Sagittarius, or evolved or positive aspected Sagittarius, might be very generous, very altruistic, very amiable, very open-hearted. Whereas another one, who might have some difficult aspects, could be very wasteful or very extravagant or very superficially friendly. These sort of things are very noticeable sometimes, and but another great word for Sagittarius is jovial, because they are fantastically jovial people. So I always think of Falstaff in Shakespeare, ho, 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 it's almost like quite a Santa Claus character, and that kind of, that jolly, jolly type effect, which is really fantastic. It's very buoyant. It's very high spirited. It's very optimistic, and very happy-go-lucky and quite carefree. Whereas the other type of Sagittarius can be exaggerating and boisterous, and and careless and sloppy and irresponsible and unreliable. So there's and or procrastinating or overextending themselves. So there's different ways of looking at it, and but the finest Sagittarian is an explorer, or outreacher. They'll go out into the world to look for things. They're freedom loving. They're outdoors oriented. But the difficult Sagittarius, a difficult problem oriented, would be the restless one, or who is full of wanderlust or can't tolerate restrictions. So those are some quite contrasting types there. Plenty to give you lots of fuel for thought there. And that brings me now to the charts of the day, of the lesson. So I have selected for you some Sagittarius charts. So we will go through. What I do with these charts is I tend to just find people with stelliums in Sagittarius. So the energy becomes very clearly obvious. When you think of that character and what they do in the world, you see it in them. That's what I'm hoping the purpose of these charts are. So all I'm doing is I'm highlighting at this early stage of your learning, I'm highlighting the idea of clusters or stelliums or groupings of planets in that sign in order to show you more about their personality, so you can see it, how it works. And then you can see maybe familiarities in different types of people. So our first character today is the BBC radio DJ Sarah Cox. And of course, we don't really necessarily see much of her, but we hear her voice a lot. She's very Sagittarius. As you can see there, she has an absolute ton of planets in Sag. She's got the sun and the moon, Mercury, the North Node, Mars, and Neptune. And that is someone who you just listen. She talks a mile a minute, and she's extremely entertaining as well. And she'll jump from subject to subject with a kind of quite just that Sagittarian nature. She's a great example of Sag, So just listen to some Sarah Cox and you'll think of Sagittarius and you'll get the idea. Really. So she's a great example. So is Zoe Ball, by the way, who is also Sagittarius, but has planets in Capricorn as well. And a moon, I think, in Libra. But that's Sarah Cox there is more Sag than Sag itself. So much there, and they all, a lot of these planets make a square to Jupiter as well. So they're quite linked to the ruler of Sagittarius, which she happens to have in Pisces. So Sarah Cox is our first chart for today. And then I've picked out Joan Armatrading, the singer-songwriter, who speaks, I believe, the truth and is very honest and very direct in her lyrics. So she has a lot of ethics and principles, and as a prolific songwriter. So she explores through creative songs, and therefore the sun and the moon in Sagittarius, and Venus, interestingly, with Chiron there, Chiron being a very sensitive point. So she has a super sensitivity about relationships with her Venus in Sagittarius, and Chiron there at the same degree, 23 Sag, 23 Sag. So she's very Chironic. So she's a healer and a teacher through her own challenges in life. So that's quite a selection there of Sagittarius as well. And then I've got Britney Spears, who has the sun and the moon and Uranus in Sagittarius. Her first hit was called Oops, I Did It Again. And that is actually completely Sagittarius. It's a Sagittarius phrase. It's a perfect Sagittarius phrase because that's what Sagittarians do. They'll quite literally be like, oops, oh, I went and did it again. It's kind of how Sagittariuses are. And this is an accurate birth time, actually, because when she was in London, she walked into the astrology shop in Covent Garden and asked for her chart, which is also quite Sagittarian, actually. She was exploring shopping in London and wandered into the astrology shop and got her chart printed. And the manager of the astrology shop, who's still there, same guy doing it today, he still talks about that day because he was so surprised. So so there is the Sun and Mercury, Uranus in Sagittarius, and Neptune as well. But that, I think, is an interesting little combination there. And yeah, so that's Britney Spears. And it's in the third house, which can be related to communications and therefore singing. She does all sorts of other things as well. I mean, she's been essentially turned into a brand. There's a whole load of issues going on for her at the moment, legal issues, funnily enough. She's been fighting for literally her sense of identity versus her father, who's had a lot of legal control over her. Anyway, it's been on TV and all sorts of stuff. She's an interesting Sagittarius character. And we also have another famous singer, Christina Aguilera, who sang the Genie in the Bottle song, which was her first hit, which is also quite like the idea of the genius, the genie. And she has the Mercury in Sagittarius with the Sun and Neptune and Venus. And she also had that really marvelous song, which is very healing and very deep, kind of very meaningful song. It brings up a lot of emotion in people. It's called Beautiful. And it's about it's you know the one you'll know the one I mean, I'm sure. It was a massive radio hit, and it still gets lots of radio play, and a really nice video to go with it. And it was a very, at the time, I think it meant a lot to a lot of people, and it sold millions of copies. So it's another song to look out for. For the Sagittarius, the truth of things, the truth of spirit, the truth of incarnation and things like that. What we're here to be, the speaking to the soul. It's a song that speaks to the soul. We've got another one who's extremely popular at the moment. Interesting how a lot of these are pop stars, music people. Sagittarius are very attracted to that. They like the stage. They like to jump and leap about. It's quite Sagittarian. So Billie Eilish. This is actually an accurate chart as well. She was born at 11:30 in the a.m. And so here we have a Pluto in Sagittarius. Okay, so these guys, this whole generation, are all about the truth, and they're here to bring a lot more humor to the world. So Pluto with Venus, the Sun, and the South Node. She's done it all before. Sun with the South Node. She's back here doing it again, which is interesting. So not that I'm a specialist in past lives or anything, but she might have been famous before. She's doing it again. So that's quite interesting. Here's a very good one. We have Emmanuel Macron, the current president of France, who has his Sun and Mercury together. So Mercury is completely combusted by the Sun. It's actually Cazimi, which means that he has very powerful, that Mercury is right in the heart of the Sun. When it's the same degree, then it's in the heart of the Sun. That's quite an interesting placement for being a spokesperson, but it's his beliefs. And he set up his own political party. He actually started his own movement. I'm not fully versed up on him, but he did actually start his own movement. And that's how he got popular. Then he changed parties, but he built his own kind of movement, which is quite Sagittarius, his own sort of philosophy, if you like. And then he moved across to a party that got him really properly in a powerful position. And he's also, he's married to his old school teacher. And of course, Sagittarius is teachers, so there's a link there with Venus and Neptune. And so this is very much speaks of being married to the teacher, if you like, So that's an interesting kind of sort of thing. An absolute classic Sagittarius is Jimi Hendrix, who was, he had to move to England to become famous. And when he did, so he traveled, he traveled like a pilgrim. He was brought across the world. And as soon as he made it to the UK, he became famous. So there's an interesting kind of, Sagittarians often have to travel. They're the traveling sign. And then he went back to America and created an absolute storm there as well. So, whereas before in America, he was not noticed at all. And in fact, he had terrible time growing up in America, So he had to do he did paratrooping and stuff. I think he I think he had, anyway, he did the army for a bit and was known to be a paratrooper and all those things. He was homeless in America, but he did also play in bands, but he was a member of bands. And then he was picked out for his skills and brought to England, and suddenly everything changed. So, so where he was born, his planets are in the 12th house. So he was hidden away in where he was born, all that Sagittarius skills. And then when he came to England, that would have changed his chart. It would have lifted these and relocated them to another part of the chart that helped make him famous. So, and then we have another rock singer, Ozzy Osbourne, who is a Sagittarius and has a very distinct voice. I think the voice is extremely interesting there. So it's Chiron with Mercury, and the sun. Again, the Mercury with the sun, it's quite combust, but that Chiron's quite interesting. And the Mercury in Sagittarius makes a square to Saturn, and I think that kind of limits the voice, but also makes it very distinctive. And so it's interesting, his voice, very interesting, and it's like what stands him out from anybody else, and so it's one of those things. And Sagittarius, I mean, he was the wild man of rock, completely wild, I mean, the stories, I mean, he in the 1970s, 80s, totally wild. And had the thing like Diary of a Madman was one of his albums, for example. And then we have the actor Jeff Bridges, who does do really good movies. My favorite movie of his is the the Dude. Can't even remember it now. Down, but it's called he's called the Dude in the movie, and he doesn't interact with Hollywood very much. He is a big Hollywood star, but he actually lives in Montana in a huge ranch, and that's that Sagittarius outdoors. He likes the mountain ranges and the big land expanse, and he does not hang out in Hollywood at all or fraternize with any of the kind of celebrity things. So you don't see him getting involved. He's a very family oriented. He has a very big family, and they all live in Montana and on this big ranch. And they, as you can see, is Sun and Mercury in Sagittarius in the 4th house, which is the sort of the home base or the foundation or that's the big ranch. So that's the spaciousness of Sagittarius. Wherever you get Sagittarius in the chart, there'll be an area for some spaciousness. And so with Jane Fonda, our next character, Barbarella from the 1960s, outer space. So, science fiction, quite Sagittarius, really. It was fun. It was a comedy film. It was meant to make people laugh, and it did. She also got involved in other she's quite comedic, Jane Fonda, but she's also very political, and she does lots of politics. And but in terms of like a resistor or a protester is more her style. But with the North Node in Sag, Venus and the Sun. So quite, her popularity for speaking truth, speaking truth to power, I think is what I'd say with Jane Fonda. And so quite a classic character there. And I just think of Barbarella as being, that's the film I think of, the Sagittarius, that kind of outer space, other planets. It's quite saggy. Now we've got to our Sun and Mars in Sagittarius. And here we have Gianni Versace, the fashion designer, born in Italy, lived in America, hugely popular with fashion. He was born with the Sun and the South Node, which is a challenge. It can be challenging in life, but it's not that challenging as well. It's something about just falling back to something. And but this Mars is opposite Uranus and quite close, relatively close to his Sun. I mean, that is a wide conjunction. And he had the most unfortunate, he was shot by a mystery assailant. And it was a most unfortunate situation, very surprising, Mars opposite Uranus, that he got that particular thing in Florida. It was at his doorway of his house, and he was just shot dead. And it was very sudden. And but that's Mars being that very, can be, it does rule guns and things, and Uranus can be surprises. So here you have a Sun South node, Mars, Uranus combination. But before that, he had huge fashion industry, huge. And because he had a sort of, he was a very sunny kind of character, very fiery, sunny character. Politics is very big with Sagittarius. So we have Sonia Gandhi's chart. Now, Sonia Gandhi is actually Italian. She was born in Italy, and then she met Rajiv in Cambridge at university, and they got married and went to India. And Rajiv Gandhi was Indira Gandhi's son. Indira Gandhi was assassinated. Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated. And then India turned to Sonia Gandhi, the Italian-born wife living in India, and said, you do politics too. And she decided that she wouldn't. She ran Congress Party in India, hugely powerful political figure, but she declined to be the prime minister. But that's a very interesting story because Sagittarius is the traveler. She was born in Italy. She was born Italian. She lived in Italy for her first 18, 19 years. Then she went to England to study at Cambridge. And which is of course higher education. And interesting that she has Sun Mars, again, with that opposite Uranus. So the Mars opposite Uranus again, you see, there's nothing, it's very close, in fact, in fact, there's only a few days between hers and Gianni Versace's chart. And they both have a very Marsy history, okay? So that Mars is hot. Mars is a difficult planet, and it can be quite random in Sagittarius. So it's interesting that I never thought about that. I just want to check that, actually. 9th of December, 1946, and Gianni Versace is the 2nd of December. So, that's interesting. All right. Anyway, so Sonia Gandhi, born in Italy, ended up becoming a hugely political figure in India, which is, the subcontinent. I mean, absolutely massive. Interesting. Sun and Mars in Sag. And then we get to Bill Hicks, the comedian, who has Venus and Mars, Mercury and the Sun. Take note of the closeness of this combination here. This is a Sun in Sagittarius with Mercury, the speaker, the mind, the thinker, the joker, with Mars prodding, poking, again, in Sagittarius, the truth. Bill Hicks was very good for speaking truth, and he would say it in such a way that made people laugh, right? But he would always say it exactly as it was. And there was something hilarious about that, but that combination as well didn't bode well for him health-wise. It really, really troubled him. So he didn't live that long. But the sun is Mars combusts to the sun. The sun hides the Mars and Mercury. So there was, I would say, a lot of anger there that maybe he didn't express, and it expressed itself through his body. He didn't get everything out that he wanted to, maybe. And but that's a Sun, Mercury, Mars. And so when you watch a video of his or any clips, think of that Sagittarius. Think of that Sagittarius nature, and you'll see it quite strongly. And now we move on to Jupiter in Sagittarius, the ruling planet of Sagittarius. A real classic has got to be William Blake, who was the prophet. He wrote the poem Jerusalem that became a hymn that's now sung in churches, and just about every single time you go to church, you can hear Jerusalem. It's a carol. It's an end of term song. It's an everything song, isn't it? Everyone sings Jerusalem all the time. It rouses everybody up. It's very patriotic, and it's sung in churches. So William Blake, although he wrote a poem, not the hymn. It was a poem originally. He was also, his artwork is phenomenal. He was a very powerful visionary, and he was very, in his own way, he had a particular way of seeing faith. He was actually very into astrology. He doesn't talk about it much, but it's that he painted Dante's Paradise and he painted Paradise Lost. So these were books that were published centuries before he was born. Dante, 13th century. So Dante had been around for 400 years, but then Blake painted it. So he painted the story of Dante's Divine Comedy. And so most of his artwork's based around that book. As same with Paradise Lost by John Milton, which was a 17th century book, so 100 years before he was born. And so these are two of his most greatest works, was what he painted. And each of them are journeys. The Divine Comedy is a journey, as is the Paradise Lost. So these are both kind of like journeying things, and it really appealed to him very much so. He was very creative. He had, as you can see there, planets in Leo, planets in Sag. And so, yeah, that was part of his nature. And I've got a couple of good examples of just Jupiter in Sag on its own. Jupiter being the ruler of Sagittarius. We've got Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now, has sold multi-million copies of his Book of Enlightenment. Jupiter in the 7th house. That's a 12 noon chart, but he's got Jupiter in Sagittarius. Okay, so this is someone who professes the truth the way that he sees it. It's his philosophy, and it did very, very well. And he didn't actually publish it till he was in his 50s. He's now in his mid to late 70s, I believe, 1948. So he's getting on a bit, but that Jupiter works well with his sun, as you can see there. So this is the sextile, 60 degrees in orb of his sun, 23, 26. Jupiter makes good aspects to his Saturn, Jupiter trine Saturn, 23 to 18, and Jupiter trine Mars in Leo. So Jupiter making good aspects, but also Jupiter opposite Uranus here at 22. So, he had something surprising to show the world, Jupiter Uranus. Interesting. And Al Gore, I think his book or his film is called The Inconvenient Truth, I believe. Truth being a watchword for Sag. He has Jupiter in Sagittarius. It is also opposite Uranus, and it is in a trine to his midheaven. This is an accurate time chart. And so he used that for his career to try and boost himself. This was more than 20 years ago. Of course, he was in the presidential election with George Bush at the time. George Bush Jr. and Al Gore was the 2000 presidential election. And he lost the election by 200 votes. That was the infamous counting machines that went wrong in Florida. That's why Al Gore lost the election. So the Democratic runner in 2000, he almost made president. He got so very close. And a lot of people were really bitter about it for years. But it was very interesting how he didn't quite get it. But his Jupiter in Sag. So he would have liked to have seen the truth. Was the truth 200 missing votes or what? But now Joe Biden's in. He's now the environment minister in the Democratic government currently in America. So he's taken a very important role again. At last, he's finally getting to speak back in politics again in a big way. So interesting character, that Jupiter there. And another Jupiter in Sagittarius is Simon Cowell, who runs competitions on TV. Vote, but he likes to put people up on stage, give them plenty of space, give them plenty of expansion via the TV camera. It's like, okay, you've got the world, now say your bit. That's quite Jupiter Sag, isn't it, really, when you think about it? So he's actually a Libra, as you can see. He's got tons of planets in Libra. But his Jupiter makes a good aspect to the North Node. And the North Node is often about connecting to people or connecting to something like that. So he does his talent shows and he says, you've got your thing, you're free to do what you want. he'll give them quite a Jupiter statement to get them going. And then now you've got your 3 minutes, go and do something with it. And then he goes on to judge them, of course, which is the cruel bit, but or the not so good bit, But that Jupiter in Sag, he creates a bit of a scene by giving them some opportunities, and of course that is Jupiter. Jupiter is the planet of opportunities. So when it's in Sagittarius, it's doubly blessed, plenty of opportunity. It gives people lots of opportunity. And then we get on to a couple of historical characters that I couldn't help but put in just because of who they are. Someone you might not necessarily have heard of too much. Tycho Brahe was a Danish astrologer in the 15th century. So in the Tudor times of the UK, over in Denmark, there was this astrologer, and he had his own island in off Copenhagen Harbour, which is still there today. It's a museum dedicated to him now. But he was riding on his horse, take note, Sagittarius, Jupiter is Sag, riding a horse. And he noted one night in December, Sagittarius, when the sun was in Sag, he saw a supernova in the sky. He saw a star explode. This was the 1572 supernova. And because he saw that star explode, he came up with a new theory that actually set science going. And because he suddenly realized that we were not inside a sphere, that there was this huge expanse. There was a lot more space up there than previously thought, because he'd seen this star explode. So the 1572 supernova, that is called Tycho's star. You could look it up on the internet. He was a big dude. He was actually the teacher of Johannes Kepler, who was also a profound astrologer who lived in Prague. Tycho lived in Copenhagen for many years, fell out with the King of Denmark, moved to Prague, spent about 10 years in Prague before he died. And that's when he had Kepler as his apprentice. And Kepler went on to do loads for astrology, but also set up the laws of planetary motion. It's another whole other story, but it's a very interesting one to look into. Tycho was the teacher of Johannes Kepler, and Kepler set up the laws of planetary motion, which Newton used then to develop his theory of gravitation. So it could be, because Tycho died under suspicious circumstances, there is a lot of people who say, oh, Kepler actually did away with his tutor because his tutor was so clever, Tycho was so clever, that anyway, I go on. But here we go. The reason I put Tycho up is because he's got Saturn in Sagittarius. Okay, and Saturn is the seventh heaven. Saturn is the outer limits, and Saturn is the boundaries. So Tycho, with Saturn in Sagittarius, was the one to see the boundaries being broken. Saturn in Sagittarius, the space or the expanse of Sagittarius, and the Saturn would be the limit or the boundary wall. But Tycho, riding his horse that night, looked up, saw this star go boom, and realized that there was a lot more out there past the boundary wall that made him think in such a way that he then had really profound thoughts that led to the development of science. So he was an astrologer who played a very necessary role at the time. Saturn in Sag, and so yeah. And that's an accurate chart as well, as you can see. And his Saturn squared the moon and Saturn squared Uranus. He really was here to do something different. He had this celestial observatory that looked at. I've seen pictures of it on his island called Haveen, which is still there today, and it was called Uraniborg. His palace was called Uraniborg, and it looked like the Royal Pavilion in Brighton with all these domes. And it was all before he had these very clever measuring devices that he would measure the distance between stars. He mapped out the whole of the known world, the universe as we know it today. He mapped it all out. He was really quite profound in what he got up to, and he was a real character, totally eccentric. He had about 12 children with one wife, and he lost his nose in a duel. He got his nose chopped off in a duel, and he wore a copper prosthetic nose, which he actually changed according to his mood. He had a gold one and a silver one and a copper one, and he would wear them with gum arabic, and he'd attach it to his nose. He had a metal nose. I'm serious. And he's buried in the cathedral in Prague. So there's that really amazing Gothic cathedral. I can't remember quite what it's called, but he's buried there. And I think his nose is in a glass box, actually, by his tombstone. And he is very famous like that. He also had a pet moose or elk. He had an elk who used to drink beer. So he had this huge, great elk wandering around his castle with him, and he also had a confidant in the shape of a dwarf called Jep, who would hide under the table at big banquets. He really was a character. Anyway, I'm going off too far now, but I did do some research on him. So Tycho, really, really classic. And here's another historical character. This guy worked at Greenwich, and he actually created longitude. So we owe him a lot, right, for his accuracy of mapping the world. Because prior to John Longitude Harrison, the world was just measured by latitudes, which are the east-west lines. So if you imagine a sphere, you imagine planet Earth, and you've just got all the lines going around as concentric lines going around, latitude, yeah, which would be, but John Harrison invented longitude, which was the pole to pole, the north-south lines. So therefore, the Greenwich Meridian, or if you live in Brighton, the Peacehaven Monument, the Greenwich Meridian, how the world sets its clocks. This guy was key to the invention of clocks and time zones. Without him, we wouldn't have time zones. So he was major player. And he had Saturn in Sagittarius. So another one who broke the boundary wall, right, about known space and time, shall we call it space again, the idea of expansive space or mapping things out. So if you go to Greenwich, which is a great day out, by the way, and you look at all the clocks, you'll see all those very clever pendulum clocks that all tick and whir. There's a couple of clocks named after him. You'll see his name. He's quite the guy. When I was at Greenwich, I took that date of birth down and looked at the chart. So I only have a 12 noon chart, you see, but it's one of those sort of things. I had to find out more about him, so I thought I'd look at his chart. And Saturn in Sag opposite Jupiter in Gemini. So that axis of the learner, the guy who, he had to find the truth. He worked very hard at finding out how to create the differences in time and therefore create time zones. And that brings us then to two more characters, just slipped in at the end there. Can't help it. C.S. Lewis, another Saturn in Sagittarius. C.S. Lewis. This guy is so inspiring. I mean, I believe I call him the secret astrologer. Of course, he developed a whole world, Narnia, the Narnia series. Amazing character, profound Christian as well, very deeply into his religion. A lot of his books are very focused on ethics and morals and principles, but he wrote the Narnia series. So, and he was one of the Inklings. He was very great friends with Tolkien. Lots of planets inside. His whole thing was he was a lecturer at Oxford for 40 years in medieval literature, and so there you go. A classic professor's chart. Lots of planets in Sag. So there we go. Right there, and the final character tonight is Ronnie Biggs, the great train robber. And I put him in because of Saturn in Sagittarius. He was the one who if Saturn is the restrictor doing time, we could call it, Sagittarius is traveling and going abroad. The great train robbery was an emotion-oriented, a traveling robbery. So he escaped justice and went to South America, but always and lived it up for like 30 or 40 years. right? And he cocked a snook at British justice. He never went back to England. He lived in South America for his whole life from that point onwards. And he was this runaway outlaw character. And he's a classic British outlaw. So that's the Saturn in Sagittarius was getting away from the justice by going abroad, Saturn in Sag. And, and he then recorded, I remember he recorded that song with the Sex Pistols, where he was like, God's out the way, sausages and mash, bulldogs and everything, Britain, and I got away. And, a classic kind of character who just got away with it, right? I don't know how he did it, but he was a real character, right? And he frustrated the British justice system immensely because they couldn't extradite him. So he lived 30, 40 years in Rio de Janeiro. And I just think that is Saturn in Sagittarius, right? And he said it was like serving time because I could never come back to England. He said I was stuck. I was stuck in Brazil. I was having a good time, but I was stuck there. I missed family, I missed friends, I missed the culture. I served my time, so he said. But back in England, the police and everyone else were like, "No, you didn't, mate. You just, But that's the kind of Saturn in Sag kind of thing there, you see. So I hope that gives you some insights. I hope that gives you some insights into Sagittarius.